Resuming debate, the honourable member for Regina Wascana.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I'm pleased to have the opportunity today to speak to Bill C-57, an act to implement the 2023 Free Trade Agreement between Canada and Ukraine. I have to admit that when I first glanced at the title of this bill when it was tabled in the House of Commons last fall, I was glad to see it for a few reasons. The first reason is because Conservatives support Ukraine. Ever since Russia's illegal invasion of that country 2 years ago, it has become imperative that all countries support Ukraine in order to preserve the rules-based international order. Otherwise, the international community risks backsliding into a pre-World War II era in which large, powerful countries are able to invade and annex their smaller neighbors with no repercussions. This is a concern that I have heard many times in my riding of Regina Wascana, not just from the many Ukrainian refugees who have moved to Saskatchewan, but also from ordinary citizens with no particular connection to Ukraine. So anything that we can do to support Ukraine is a good thing. The second reason why I had high hopes for this bill is because Conservatives support free trade. Long gone are the days of economic nationalism when governments insisted on an unlevel playing field in order to protect domestic companies at the expense of consumers. Instead, Canadians and the international community have come to recognize the benefits of free trade. It allows Canadian companies to pursue new opportunities and to find new customers for their products and services, and it allows Canadian consumers to enjoy a variety of products and services from all around the world at the lowest possible prices. In fact, Conservative support for free trade goes back many years to the times of Prime Minister Stephen Harper and Prime Minister Brian Mulroney. Finally, I thought that if nothing else, the Canada-Ukraine Free Trade Agreement would give us something different to talk about for a while. For example, we've had many debates in this chamber about the Liberals' carbon tax. I know I have received many emails and phone calls from my constituents about the carbon tax and how it's making life more expensive every time they fill their tanks up with gas, every time they go to the grocery store to do their shopping, and every time they pay their home heating bills. So I thought that this bill would give us a break from talking about the carbon tax, because obviously a free trade agreement should have nothing to do with the carbon tax. So I have to say that I was surprised and disappointed to find that the Liberals' carbon tax has made its way into our free trade agreement with Ukraine. In Chapter 13 of the agreement, which is the Environment chapter, under Article 10, Ukraine will be required to, quote, promote carbon pricing and measures to mitigate carbon leakage, unquote. Madam Speaker, free trade agreements are supposed to be about trade and encouraging the free flow of goods and services between our two countries. It should not be about imposing a carbon tax on Ukraine. The same Liberal carbon tax that has been making life more difficult for Canadians will soon be making life more difficult for Ukrainians as well, assuming this bill passes. A carbon tax is not only the last thing that Canadians want, it is also the last thing that Ukrainians need, given that they are in the middle of a war. It would make infinitely more sense to help the Ukrainians win the war first, and then to remove every Russian soldier from Ukrainian soil before beginning any talk about a carbon tax and how to implement a carbon tax in the middle of a war zone. I was also hoping, Madam Speaker, that this bill would give us a break from talking about the Liberals' unrealistic net zero emissions targets. Over the last 8 years, the Liberals have come up with a long list of very expensive net zero emissions targets: phasing out fossil fuels, fertilizer restrictions for farmers, and ending the sale of gas-powered cars. All initiatives that will make life less affordable for Canadians. So I thought that this bill would give us a break from talking about these net zero emissions targets, because obviously free trade should have nothing to do with net zero emissions targets. So again, I have to say that I was disappointed that the Liberals' net zero emissions targets have made their way into our free trade agreement with Ukraine. Again, in Chapter 13, Article 10, Ukraine will be required to, quote, transition to net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050, unquote. Madam Speaker, transitioning to net zero emissions has proven difficult enough for Canadians to do. And we don't have a war going on in this country. We don't have the Russians bombing us every day like the Ukrainians do. It is ridiculous to expect Ukrainians to meet this goal given what they're going through right now. It has also been well documented that the Russians have been targeting the Ukrainian power grid in order to maximize human suffering. And so if the Ukrainian power grid is going to be in shambles for the foreseeable future, one can reasonably expect that they will have to rely on various backup diesel generators and gas-powered vehicles for some time to come. It's not realistic to expect them to switch to electric cars. It's not realistic to expect them to switch to electric tanks or electric armored personnel carriers. It's not realistic to expect Ukrainian rockets to stop burning rocket fuel, or Ukrainian jets to stop burning jet fuel, or Ukrainian helicopters to stop burning fuel anytime soon. I was also hoping, Madam Speaker, that the debate over this free trade agreement would give us a break from the debate over the phase-out of coal. Because a free trade agreement should have nothing to do with the phase-out of coal. Yet, once again, the Liberals' plan to phase out coal has made its way into the free trade agreement with Ukraine. In Chapter 13, Article 10, Ukraine will be required to, quote, promote the rapid transition from unabated coal power, unquote. Madam Speaker, it should be plain to see that imposing the phase-out of coal will be a major burden to the Ukrainian people, who quite frankly have more pressing concerns. Approximately 25% of Ukraine's electricity comes from coal, although that number is very volatile given that they are in the middle of a war and that the Russians have been consistently targeting Ukraine's power grid. It's very conceivable that Ukraine may have to rely on coal for quite some time to come. Madam Speaker, when President Zelensky addressed Parliament last fall, he could not have been more clear that fighting and winning the war was his #1 priority. So the question has to be asked, how does this free trade agreement help Ukraine to win the war? How will imposing a carbon tax on Ukraine help them stop more Russian soldiers from occupying Ukrainian soil? How will imposing net zero targets on Ukraine destroy more Russian tanks? How will shutting down Ukrainian coal plants sink more Russian ships in the Black Sea? Of course, Madam Speaker, the sad answer is that these measures will not be helpful to the Ukrainian war effort, and therefore they should not be in this free trade agreement and they should not be supported. Another topic that President Zelensky addressed in his speech to this chamber last September was Russia's weaponization of its energy exports. Madam Speaker, one of the best things that Canada could do to help Ukraine win the war is to increase Canadian oil and gas exports to Western Europe so they can stop buying from Russia. Every dollar that Western Europe spends on Russian oil and gas only enables Vladimir Putin to buy more bombs and planes and tanks to use against the Ukrainians. This Liberal government should be embarrassed for not doing more to increase Canadian oil and gas exports to Europe. Madam Speaker, I think that I can best summarize the differences between the parties in their support for Ukraine in this way. Conservatives support Ukraine unconditionally. The Liberals support Ukraine with strings attached. There is no reason for this free trade agreement to be pushed forward now. The current free trade agreement between Canada and Ukraine, which was signed in 2017, can stay in place until after the Ukrainians have won the war and are ready to sit down with us. In the meantime, Canada should continue to be generous in welcoming Ukrainian refugees to our country, and we should continue to be generous in our economic and military aid to Ukraine. As for Bill C-57, Madam Speaker, I believe that we should not be in favor of this bill. The Liberals should withdraw this bill, and we should let the current free trade agreement stay in place until the war is won. After the war is over,
The honourable member is out of time quite a bit.